The Galactic Council's chamber was built to intimidate vaulted stone, cold echoes, and a floor pattern that forced the speaker to stand precisely under the eye of 1,000 delegates while their voices climbed the walls like a tide. Commander Mara Solace stood in the circle and refused to raise her voice. And that was what silenced them first, the absence of pleading, the lack of heat, the way she adjusted a cuff and looked not at faces, but at the gaps between them, as if measuring distances she would later weaponize. "We ask for peace," she said, and her words carried like a blade held flat, light sliding along the edge. "We ask for sovereignty. We ask that the border raids end." Small laughter spattered the tears thin. Brittle sounds in a room that had forgotten quiet hours ago. "If you provoke us," Mara continued, "you will learn what silence means." A few translators stumbled. The word had too many meanings, in too many tongues. Mara let the confusion breathe. She had learned long ago never to hurry comprehension. A mind best remembers what it is forced to ask twice. High Prelate Varkesh, wearing a carapace polished to a mirror black, leaned forward with the indulgent smile of a monarch, humoring a poet. "Is Terra threatening the galaxy?" he asked. "No," Mara said. "Terra is telling the truth." She did not list fleets, or tonnage, or the new hull geometry the shipwrights called obsidian veined. She did not raise a specter of doomsday machines. She described a boundary as if outlining a chalk line before a duel. "You do not cross. You do not take. You do not test our patience. Your coalitions will call this pride. It is restraint." When she finished, the council did what it always did. It debated its reflection. Committees spoke to committees. The moderator of Stone Ruten watched from the shadow of a basalt column and felt the rare friction of doubt. He had seen the patterns in the human incident logs, the perfect evacuations, the way civilian traffic bled from a system in neat parabolas, as though obeying tides, the abrupt quiet that followed. He tried to name it, and found no word that fit in the council's tongue. The vote came anyway. On a wall of light, icons turned from amber to green, authorization of disciplinary incursions into human frontier space by a limited coalition of sovereigns to restore compliance. Varkesh's smile stretched. He spoke of short campaigns and the moral education of young species. Mara did not ask to speak again. She slid a slate across the plinth. It contained 3 lines: notice, boundary, silence. She left without turning her back on the chamber. Ruten watched her go with the sensation that the room had grown larger, not smaller, as if she had removed something the rest of them had been leaning on without knowing. In the hours that followed, feeds filled with banners and hull cam footage. The coalition's first detachments curved toward 2 human colonies, Vesper and Holiday's Reach, systems with shallow wells and pretty, unprotected moons. Anchor commentators told stories of inevitability. Admirals rehearsed speeches about proportionality. The word example passed through too many mouths. On Vesper, the alarm went out at local dawn. The sky had that milk blue all frontier worlds share before heat has time to bite. Children are already dressed when the siren spoke, and that, more than anything, told the invaders they had built a narrative with the wrong protagonist. Across the colony, a choreography began that no coalition simulator had modeled. Schools became assembly hubs. Crop haulers rolled to the spaceport in an order that matched wing patterns and port geometry. The last shuttle departed not when full, but when the window of safe ascent closed to a number taught in every. Vesper School, 11 seconds. On the 6th ascent, a coalition frigate's dorsal guns raked the sky. The shuttle broke into white rain. The evac lead did not shout. She crossed off a column and rerouted her last 3 craft. When the Marines reached the port, they found no fuel trucks, no spare parts, no databanks. Cables coiled like molted skins, nothing left inside. They laughed anyway victory laughs, the kind made for cameras. A corporal asked why the port's beacon still pulsed if the tower was cold. "Because a beacon can be a promise," said his sergeant, "or a lure." He pointed up, and for a heartbeat, the corporal thought the sky had produced a second moon. It was only the sun glancing off a belt of debris you can't see until you're inside it. The first escort that tried to escort anything out of Vesper died without reporting. The second died inventing a word for a weapon its pilot had never seen. A third marked a grid in its black box that, when examined later, would be the skeleton of a pattern Rutan would trace with the finger in an empty room and whisper, "Discipline." The feeds, for a while, kept laughing. Holiday's reach burned slower. The coalition wanted spectacle there, a long lesson. They landed banners in the plaza and ringed the Capitol dome with armor, then cut the municipal net and broadcast the surrender in 6 languages. The first hour gave them everything they wanted: tears, the long angles of smoke, a choir of fear. In the second hour, their forward sensor pickets failed in sequence, one every 9 minutes, then one every 6. The cadence mattered, but only to those who listened for the metronome beneath the melody. Commander Mara Solace listened. She was not on Holiday's reach. She was a 4-day burn away, standing on a gantry in a shipyard no map yet admitted. Hand on the warm skin of a hull that drank light. It was not yet a ship in the legal sense. The register listed it as a heat sink with experimental plumbing. The engineers called it Nocturne class because no one could look at it without thinking of night. Along its facets ran veins of conductive ceramic that would appear to a hurried sensor pass like artifacts or repair seams. "Do you have to make it beautiful?" Mara asked the chief. "Beauty is a side effect of good math," the chief said without looking up. "Besides, it wants to be cold. Cold is elegant." A runner brought news from Vesper and the Reach. Mara did not change expression. She signed 3 orders. Seal the Vosser array along the Lauren corridor. Authorize Minispector patterns Hush 3 through Hush 7. Initiate the cairn protocol on all stations that would be abandoned. "Cairn?" the chief asked. "They took our epitaphs when they took our dead," Mara said. "We put the epitaphs back." Cairns were small, cheap, and patient stations the size of freight containers, with nothing but a recorder, a transmitter, and a coil of very old poetry. They slept until their casing cracked. Then they said names. No accusations, no curses, just names and coordinates, and the timestamp of a promise broken. On the 4th hour of the occupation, a coalition lieutenant wrote in a private log that he had never tasted air so thin. He checked the pressure twice. He had the habit of describing fear as flavor pepper in the gums, iron on the tongue. He told himself he was tasting smoke. He did not see the corridor collapse under his squad, because collapses are rarely theatrical when designed by people who farm. The tunnels jumped just a little so that valves misread their own state, and gravity did the rest. The Reach's mines were not mines in the explosive sense, but in the patient one. A mine is what takes your tool when you reach for it. The coalition's tools vanished. Water that turned bitter. Alloy that remembered a phase it was not meant to. Doors that promised open, then learned shut. The broadcasts kept running, but the camera angles grew claustrophobic, the color grading colder. "This is foolishness," said Vartish on a flagship that hummed with the sound of too much agreement. "They bleed themselves to spite us." "They count," said Rutan to a room no one had asked him to speak to. He watched the cadence of sensor failures and saw not chaos but a clock. He wrote to the Council's war board and attached 3 human texts, a treatise on logistics, a children's primer on evacuations, and a poem about winter. He received an automated acknowledgement and an invitation to a reception. In the 5th hour, a cairn woke at the edge of the Reach's night side. The casing had been breached by a curious private with a pribar. The station warmed and exhaled. It said 37 names, then a coordinate, then "You were warned." The private dropped the bar as if it had burned him. That was when the barracks blew. Not a spectacular fireball compression, mostly. The kind of failure that looks like tired metal taking a breath and deciding not to bother. "Sabotage," the coalition said. "Ghosts," the privates whispered. The word ghost moves fast in armies. It outruns orders, reassures the unlucky, explains the inexplicable, and arrives, panting, at command tents just as the first real mistakes begin. Mara stepped off the gantry and let the hull cool in her shadow. "When?" the chief asked. "When they convince themselves we've stopped," she said. "When they talk in full voices again." She looked not at the ship, but through it. At the map, it would swim a map she had learned to read in the negative. Not where anything was, but where nothing would be. "Silence isn't fear," she said, to the ship or to herself. "Silence is the room we build for a lesson to echo." The feeds laughed less that day. not because they had grown wise, but because laughter wants company, and company had started to go missing. They called it the corridor of choirs after the fact. Because nothing screamed their signals didn't, hulls didn't. Even the men and women inside forgot how to fill their lungs past the collarbone. Patrol Group Keeler 19 entered at standard dispersion. 40 light minutes between pickets, telemetry strung like festival lanterns from ship to ship. The first lantern went out. The second flickered and insisted, in a pleasant tone, that it had never been lit. Lieutenant Ranker Sell bet his bunkmate a ration bar that it was a software bug and climbed into the bay to reset a balky sensor. Cluster with the heel of his hand. He liked fixing things with quick noises. He had a private superstition that the universe respected decisiveness. Outside his ship's facet window, the starfield thinned. It didn't dim. It didn't cloud. It simply lost consonants. Constellations forgetting the strokes that made them letters. Sell radioed the Stingboat on his long port and asked if they'd changed their optics profile. The Stingboat answered with a cheerful, recorded, all good loop that played 5 times before the comms officer bit her lip and cut the line. It isn't dread that kills a formation first. It's embarrassment, an unwillingness to admit that something basic has been misplaced. Keeler 19 kept station. They logged the anomalies, flagged maintenance, and reminded each other that humans cobbled their ships and barns out of weathered gratitude and stubbornness. They said this as a kindness to themselves. The corridor did not listen. It closed a hand around their confidence and squeezed, gently at first, testing. The Vosser array does no violence on its own. It curves telemetry, persuades rangefinders to fall in love with their own reflections, misnames the direction of home. It is a liar with exquisite manners. The third lantern died. Captain Oss, who had never learned to love empty space, issued a correction order that would have pulled the pickets back into visual range. The order walked 5 centimeters down a fiber optic trunk and disappeared into a small, hungry box with a ceramic grin that an engineer on Vesper had printed from recycled plow handles. On ship cams, Oss's lips went on moving, issuing the order over and over, a loop that bled into the crew's dreams. Sell tightened the last clamp on the sensor cluster and felt, at the base of his skull, the specific stillness that means a ship has decided to coast. He drifted to a port and pressed his forehead against the cool, tried to think of planetary mornings and the smell of boiled grain. The starfield hiccuped, and in the hiccup, something large put its weight where distance should have been. He didn't see a shape. He saw a subtraction so clean it made a shape by outline. Contact? He asked, because questions are rope. All good, said the Stingboat on his long port as cheerfully as before. Sell laughed, and the laugh sounded wrong in his mouth, like he'd stolen it from a happier man. Patrol Group Keeler 19 lost 5 ships in 20 minutes without a single hull breach. They went missing the way keys do in kitchens. They were set down where hands had always been sure. And then the table learned a new trick. On the 6th missing, Captain Oss did not ask permission. He throttled into a turn that should have dragged 2 pickets into view. The turn happened. The pickets did not. Oss stared through an optic and tried to will grammar back into the sky. Look, Sell said into a dead channel. I think they built a room out here. It was a decent guess for a man who had never seen a room big enough to keep a star honest. The array had folded a pocket around Keeler 19, not by force, but by etiquette, by teaching instruments to wait their turn and never calling their number. The first distress ping that escaped the pocket arrived in the inbox of Rutan's aide, along with a wine-tasting invitation and a petition to rename a boulevard after an admiral. The aide flagged it low priority. Rutan, who had learned to read 2 things at once, text and the silence between texts, pulled the packet and played it twice. The second time, he listened not to the words, but to the cadence. He heard an echo that should not be in vacuum, a delay too smooth to be a jam. He wrote a note. They are building absence. He sent it to a distribution list he knew would not read it, then stood anyway, and went looking for someone who would be offended by the fact of his concern. In the corridor, Sell decided that decisive men deserved afterlives, and went to the prow to do something brave and useful, preferably in that order. He found neither. The prow met him with a view like the inside of a closed eye. He put his palm to the glass and felt the ship's heart beating slow. He thought of the stories they had told about humans in barracks in Mars. Never surrender, madness at the margins, knives hidden in teeth. He had laughed with the rest. He tried now to shape a different story in his mouth, and found that all he had was a word they were not supposed to use on duty. Ghosts, he said, and the ship pretended not to hear him. It's a kind of courtesy, pretending not to hear. The sixth lantern went out. The logs tried to right themselves and failed. Because writing is an agreement with the future, and the future had stepped out. The shipyard had no sun. It borrowed stars. The hull under Mara's fingers hummed in the way of large, patient predators, no menace. Just a reminder that mass likes to sing when you ask it to be silent. Nocturne 1 did not yet have a name. There was superstition about that. Names called attention. Until launch. The engineers called her the vessel, in the way parents say, the baby, before a first cry makes a person in the room. You won't get to be there for her first hunt, the chief said, not unkindly. Be glad, Mara said. First hunts are for learning to be cruel, or learning not to need to be, she signed. Off on the final veins, the conductive channels that would wick waste heat into. Angles and shadows rather than radiant flares. The ship would look, to rushed eyes, like an absence with boundaries. Like someone had cut a wedge out of space and decided to keep it for art. A runner brought a dispatch pouch with the latest from the corridor, and Holiday's Reach. A photo sat on top. 37 names projected on a wall in white. A private's hand against them, as if measuring the size of his guilt. Mara put the photo under the hull light and let the veins throw strange shadows across the names. Cairns are working, the chief said. They're not weapons, Mara said. They're mirrors. We make them carry their own reflection. Mirrors can cut, the chief said. Glass remembers sand and wind. The launch sequence read like prayer. Test the cold loop. Coax the core into a lazy, contented hum. Whisper to the thrusters that they would be asked to perform impoliteness later. Not now. The array is sealed along Lauren, an ops tech said. We'll have to fly the long dark to test without announcing ourselves. Good, Mara said. Announcing is for victors and liars. We're neither yet. She stepped back and watched the crew move, a tide that knew which stones to flow around. She thought of Vesper's 11-second window, of a crop hauler's engine turned sideways to make a fan for a burned tunnel, of a girl with a stopwatch counting backward while her brother tied a shoe faster than he ever had in his life. The stories had already begun to circulate. Humans love to teach with stories they can carry in a pocket and turn like a coin. Tell them about the window, she had told evac leaders. Not about heroism, about math. The feeds, for a few hours, had tried to make a virtue of human stubbornness, as if the frontier had asked to be a stage. Then the feeds had begun to eat their own gaps, cutting to other stories when a camera lost its nerve and stared too long at an empty square of sky. Rue 10 arrived at the Council's warboard with a quiver in his patience he had not felt since he had been too young to. Imagine that institutions could learn. You are receiving distress from Keeler 19, he said. It smells like a trap, a Commodore said, as if cleverness were inoculation. It smells like discipline, Rue 10 said. They are not jamming. They are misnaming. Our instruments are mannered. They obey etiquette. The humans are teaching them new manners. Poetry, someone said with contempt. Engineering, Rue 10 said, and set 3 human documents on the table. A manual on convoy deconfliction with coffee stains on the margins. A textbook on agricultural water allocation. A poem about a winter river that learns to carry its cold on the surface so fish can live below. They think in schedules, he said. They fight in calendars. Then we crush them before a calendar turns, Markish said, entering late with the confidence of men who believe doors wait for their footsteps. He laid out a map with bold, generous arrows and numbers that looked like triumph. Hundreds, he said. We bring hundreds, and we bring the lesson to their door. They are building a door, Rue 10 said softly. They will decide which way it opens. In the yard, the ship let out a breath you couldn't hear, only feel as pressure in teeth and bone. The chief looked at Mara with an expression like being proud of a storm. You'll need a name, she said. Mara thought of the way the council chamber had sounded when she spoke. The hush not of respect, but of people saving their volume for later. Veil, she said. No, the chief said, because superstition matters. Veil is for hiding. This one is for teaching. And notary, Mara said. The chief laughed. You're going to make the universe sign where it refused to read. Exactly, Mara said. We warned them. Now we record. She wrote the name on a slate and set it against the cool. And for a moment, the veins seemed to glow brighter, as if warmth liked the shape of the word. The array's far edge quivered, a fish-silver flicker on an ops display. Keeler 19 has stopped sending, the text said. Stopped like silence? Mara asked. Stopped like nothing, the text said. There's a difference. There is, Mara said, and felt in her chest the quiet widen, the room she was building for a lesson to echo. Light the long dark. We test tonight. They picked a moon that had learned humility airless, cratered, a coin someone had chewed, orbiting a dull red the color of old cautions. The coalition task forced 50 ships by the count of people who still trusted numbers when fear could change their shape arrived in neat geometry and found nothing unruly enough to hate. Forward screen, burn the shadows, the Commodore said, which is what you say when your doctrine explains the universe to you. The shadows obliged by behaving like shadows until notary slid from the moon's night like a continent remembering that it had been coastline once. Sensors wrote asteroid and then apologized to themselves, which is something good instruments do when they realize they have embarrassed their operator. Notary did not decloak. She had no cloak. She announced herself by refusing to reflect, by holding starlight like a grudge. Target, said 3 voices on 3 bridges, with the same sudden dryness in the throat. The first salvo that hit her hull sparkled and ran like beads of rain on oiled stone. The beam that should have bored laid down a white line and went out at the edge of a conduction, vain with the politeness of a guest who has recognized a closed door. On Notary's bridge, Mara watched the temperature gradients settle into the map she had argued into existence. In a meeting that had smelled like coolant and prayer, keep her cold, she said. Cold is mercy. The gunnery lead, who loved heat like most artisans do, smiled because she understood that mercy, properly applied, is arithmetic. On your mark, she said. Mara did not mark. She waited until the coalition's forward ship spread, until eagerness pulled their geometry out of true, until the rear guard had to choose between formation and pride, and chose pride. Now, Mara said, and the first broadside left notary like a verdict. Lances of coherence was the term the engineers used because they liked elegance, but the crew had a cruder name for them that turned the mouth into a line. The lances did not explode. They did not bloom. They made planes. They made decisions. A destroyer became 2 halves that thought, for a second, that they would continue being themselves. And they remembered gravity and the idea of integrity. 10 ships went from present tense to past perfect in under a minute. The commodity of screens, flooded channels, and then choked on its own bandwidth. Concentrate, the Commodore said. And ships concentrated into the shape of men who had been promised that concentration repelled knives. Notary slid through the fire with the grace of something that had learned beforehand where heat would be, because Mara had been teaching heat to prefer other places for months. She painted the rear guard with a touch so light the guard did not register insult until control surfaces lost the small conversations that make a ship self. On a Keeler cruiser, a captain realized that she had no thrusters and too much dignity to confess. She turned to say something heroic and found no one to say it to. What is that hull? Asked Varkish over a priority channel that did not wait its turn. Cold, someone said, and the word traveled down the spine of the armada, touching vertebrae with a polite knuckle. Mara did not pursue the broken. She had written a doctrine on a napkin once, the way good doctrines are born, that said, we leave witnesses who can count. Notary circled the Commodore's flagship at a distance that looked like contempt and was in fact a measurement the exact length of a lesson the other ship could survive. The gunnery lead held fire with a tremor in the wrist that could be love. Mark, Mara said, and Notary spoke once more with the voice of decision. The flagship's bow opened like a mouth that had never learned to say no. Inside the bridge, Wait found new loyalties. The Commodore thought for one brief, absolute second of a winter river and did not know why. Cease, Mara said, and her voice carried not mercy, Let's schedule. Withdraw along your safest line, she transmitted on open bands. Tape your broken. Do not return to this corridor. The room you entered is not for you. In a dozen languages, that last line made more sense than any weapon. Half the surviving ships ran without looking back, which is how grown men and women run when they remember something their grandparents told them and decide, finally, to believe. A Keeler captain who believed in tradition tried to reverse the route by shouting his name into the channel, as if naming could anchor time. The only reply he got was the echo of his own career. Notary banked toward the moon and let its night wash her. Heat spike forward, the gunnery lead said. We're seen. Good, Mara said. Let them see the lesson that didn't kill them. She could feel the feed straining to reassert narrative. This must be the super weapon, the invincible hull, a singular terror. She almost pitied the story. It had so few characters to work with when faced with a doctrine. We will be accused of cruelty, the chief said over an internal line. We will be accused of restraint, Mara said, by people who cannot tell the difference. The feeds did what feeds do when the spectacle ends and the math begins. They cut away to personalities. Experts with excellent hair argued about heat budgets and unknown alloys. Admirals retired just shy of disgrace said that humans had always been dangerous and praised their own foresight. A talking head with a smile like a polished blade suggested that the lesson was already learned and that the coalition, chastened, would adjust. The coalition adjusted by making itself bigger. Varkesh assembled. With lavish ceremony, the largest armada fielded in living memory. Hundreds of hulls gathered at a rendezvous point named, without irony, Concord. Broadcasters filmed them from angles that erased the empty space between ships, because nothing spooks a public like gaps. Ru-10 watched the parade of mass and thought of the way people clap at the wrong time in symphonies. He sent one more memo. They do not meet mass with mass. He attached, for the stubborn, a sketch of a pocket field and a literary quote about doors. No one wrote back except a junior analyst who thanked him for the poem. In the long dark, Mara laid the map. The trap was not a box. Boxes imply edges you can touch. It was a gradient of impoliteness zones, where instruments would adopt new etiquette at different rates. Gaps where signals would go to learn silence. Cones where heat would be herded like animals, between fences you couldn't see. Lay stations hush 9 through hush 12, she said. Stagger their wake routines. I want each to greet the armada with a different kind of hello. Hush stations did not fight. They announced the rules of a room in tones you couldn't hear, but your equipment could. Here, your beams bloom too soon. Here, your lags smooth out until orders arrive apologizing for their lateness. Here, your decoys forget they were supposed to be brave. And the cairns? The chief asked. We plant them where the cameras will live, Mara said. Let the world hear names when metals fail. She set the trap not around Concord, but where Concord would have to pass to become. Triumph the route a man takes back to his own mirror. We leave the first corridor open, she said. We let them form lines. Pride needs lines. Her staff looked at the model and saw the geometry of humiliation. Wedges of force that never meet their opposites. A stage where choreography becomes slapstick and then stops being funny. We'll be accused of theater, the chief said. We are making a classroom, Mara said. Theater has curtain calls. Classrooms have tests. The armada moved. It moved with an inertia of certainty that had carried empires across gulfs for generations. It moved with banners and hot, crowded channels and the squeal of too many ships trying to fit into a story that had been written with fewer characters in mind. At the pocket's lip, Hush 9 woke and said, in 3 kinds of etiquette, that the armada was early to its own funeral. Instruments argued. The admirals did not hear the argument. They were busy being filmed. The first rank entered a zone where distance had a different opinion than usual. Formations loosened by accident. Orders arrived lovely and calm 40 seconds too late. Hold, someone said. But the word found no anchor and slid along the top of the fleet like a leaf on oiled water. Notary was not alone now. Smaller holes, siblings built on the same cold math, slid along the gradient, riding friendlier currents. They did not present noses like dueling gentlemen. They arrived sideways and at dignified distances, as if here to audit, not to perform. Wave 1, Mara said. The siblings did not fire lances. They fired absence packets that told certain shield architectures to remember older versions of themselves with charming bugs. The shields complied out of nostalgia and failed at the edges where nostalgia always fails. Wave 2, Mara said. Minds that were not minds. Doors that were not doors. Nets that were not nets. Everyone insists on familiar nouns when the new thing is too rude to be named tightened. Cones of death are a real thing and have a terrible beauty when you see them laid over a tactical plot. All geometry and clean cruelty. But Mara did not care for cones. Cones flatter gunners. She cared for calendars. She watched timestamps. She waited for the moment when the Armada's logistics fuel, coolant, attention would discover that they had been spending beyond their means since Concord. Wave 3, she said, and the trap revealed its last lesson, that panic is a line item and interest compounds. Ships tried to turn in a medium that had decided that turns were gauche. Flags went dark, not when hit, but when called. Channels became lists of names, and then became nothing. In the middle of it, Rue 10 stood in the council chamber and spoke to people who had finally learned to lower their voices. They built a door, he said. We walked through. It did not become our room. Varkesh asked for reinforcements with the aggrieved certainty of a man who believes reality owes him courtesy. Withdraw, Mara transmitted on open bands once more. And because she had told the truth before, the words arrived brighter than the fire. Some did. Enough did. The rest became proof that silence had weight. The Armada's death did not arrive as a moment. It arrived as a schedule. Pride is loud and prefers crescendo's horns. Banners. Decisive verbs shouted across open channels, but the room Mara built did not allow crescendos to keep their shape. Hush 11 woke first, not with noise, but with expectation. In its volume of space, signals learned to move as if they wore formal clothes, smoothing edges, arriving with apologies. The forward ranks adapted by instinct, like people lowering their voices in a cathedral without knowing the creed. Hold interval, the admiral said, and the interval obeyed some ships and politely forgot others. Notary drifted at the perimeter with siblings that looked like punctuation commas that let breath in the fleet's sentence, parentheses that rearranged the clause. They did not block. They did not ram. They did not even threaten. They existed. And in existing, they adjusted what existence meant in that corridor. Begin the cones, the gunnery lead suggested, because there is a comfort in geometry, a way of believing that if triangles point at a thing, the thing owes respect. Not yet, Mara said. She had written her timeline with hands that knew chores, when to light stoves. When the kettle admits its first hiss, how long bread must be left uncut, or it punishes mouths. Where is their attention? On themselves, the chief said. They're trying to remember how to be a line. Good, Mara said. We do not punish concentration. We let it make its own mistake. Hush 10 unrolled like a carpet of small impolitenesses. Shield Lattice found themselves recalling last year's furware with a fondness that had no place in a fight. Decoys second-guessed their heroism. Thruster governors became prim, and weapons officers, good ones, trained to love the proof that math keeps its promises, discovered that the universe they relied on had developed a sense of humor. A cruiser, eager to showcase doctrine, cut across an axis that no longer agreed to be perpendicular. Its escort followed with the loyalty of younger siblings. In their wake, the Armada's surface rippled as formations negotiated with an etiquette they had not voted for. Wave 1, Mara said, and the siblings whispered absence into the shield nets again. This time absence stayed. Light struck and scattered as if it had found fog. Kinetics arrived and forgot who sent them. The Admiralty accused jamming. The jammers were insulted. Jamming is blunt. This was matters. We are not stopping them, the chief said, watching a wedge of heavy hulls plow forward through molasses that only their instruments could taste. We are letting them arrive late to their own decisions. Mara said, the first true mistake belonged to logistics, the quiet giant that wins wars and is never invited to parades. Coolant trains that should have staggered their burns, sluiced through the same window and arrived sweating and out of breath. Fuel barges tried to reverse flow in pipes that had learned a new tense future conditional while. The Armada consumed comfort like a nervous habit. They're spiking their own heat, the gunnery lead said. Awe in the voice of a craftsperson, recognizing a masterpiece not their own. They are clapping between movements, Mara said. Begin cones. The plot blossomed with fields of denial. Notary and her siblings did not draw wedges of death and shove. They placed gentle, precise interdictions, slices of space, where a term wasted too much delta V. Corridors where a burn meant arriving under the wrong constellation. Alleys where any ship that insisted on bravery would be brave alone. On 3 simultaneous bridges, 3 admirals discovered that the commands in their mouths had gone out of fashion. They shouted anyway, because men who have been respected by rooms hate to learn the room is tired. Flagship maneuvering to regain center, a sensor officer reported, and Mara gave the flagship the courtesy due its ambition. Open a lane thin, she said. Let them think the middle still exists. The flagship turned into the gift with the gratitude of a drowning man, grateful to the wave that decides to be a slope. It did not notice the corridor was graded safe enough to enter, too steep to rise. Mark, Mara said. Notary's lenses did not cut. They suggested. Bulkheads listened and tired of holding their breath. The flagship's mouth opened again. The strange, obedient yawn of stressed alloys meeting the kind word that allows them to rest. Broadcast, Mara said. Her voice went out along channels, cleaned by truth, the last time she had used them. Withdraw by the route of least embarrassment. Carry your wounded. Do not look for honor here. It is not issued in this room. Swords clattered in throats. A third of the armada fled. Another third discovered that fleeing is a profession, not an instinct. The last third tried to teach the room that it was wrong. On a distant dais, Ru-10 spoke to a chamber that finally understood what whispering is for. He used no numbers. He described, instead, the feeling of a corridor that changes you as you pass. As water changes the hand that moves through it. They built a door, he said, and invited us to learn which way it swings. We insisted the hinge obey us. It did not. The council did not vote. It did not move. It listened to itself become smaller. The armada's feed cut not with drama, but with tiredness. As cameras found only the privacy of men and women, learning fear after careers that had promised them excitement instead. Notary swung her bow away from the breaking and drifted into the long dark. Engines humming like a satisfied cat, somewhere you cannot see. Accusations will come, the chief said. Cruelty, cowardice, trickery. Good, Mara said. Accusations create silence around themselves. We will need more room. They called the first planet Bridge, because it was not a capital and not a fortress, just a span between a proud core and the habit of bullying frontier worlds. Its orbit sat along a trade artery fat with smugness. Bridge had celebrated the Armada's departure with fireworks. Now it lit vigil candles and tried to remember hymns. Notary did not approach alone. The siblings surfaced like punctuation again, commas at the ends of clauses where the enemy expected periods. Targets? The gunnery lead asked, and Mara opened her hand. Command nodes, depots, signal towers. No habitations, no hospitals, no water. We can starve them, a young officer said, somewhere between outrage and desire. We can, Mara said. We will not. She remembered Vesper's market mornings, the weigher who could find balance, even when the scales were tired. War that keeps the next harvest alive is harder and will be done. The first strike was a letter, the cairns. They woke in a belt between moons and began to speak the names of the dead, each in a voice that refused Jean Renault funerary music. No drum roll, just the clarity that makes a child answer, present, at roll call. Names bent the news cycle. Clips of exploding barracks fell out of fashion. Anchors looked into cameras and measured their words against ghosts that did not accuse, only persisted. On Bridge, the crowd that had come to spit at the sky stood with hats in hands instead and pretended. The weather had grown solemn. Begin decapitation, Mara said, and Notary's lances drew signatures out of the command web. Signals died like sentences losing verbs. A depot's roof leapt in relief and then settled into a neat collapse. A shipyard that had built fast, arrogant hulls remembered patience and took a long nap. No civilian lines cut, the chief announced, and ops murmured the affirmation they had been trained to love. It is a particular pleasure to destroy without breaking the thing that lets tomorrow begin. Open a corridor, Mara said, toward the council's relay. The corridor flashed on the plot, thin and unlovely. They will call it mercy, the gunnery lead said. It is homework, Mara said. They will decide whether to hand it in. Varkish tried to. He sent a packet that apologized for overreach and promised reparations the way a man promises to drink less when glass is still in hand. Mara replied with 3 lines. Notice, boundary, silence. Ridge capitulated between those lines. Governors, who had rehearsed courage, looked at their children and chose a different audience. Mara accepted terms without banners, because banners are for endings, and this was a change in homework policy. Post-ops, the chief said, requests guidelines. Mara sent them the old ones, the ones recorded in plain language, before anything terrible had needed to be learned. Feed the prisoners. Keep the lights on where light is needed. Write down names correctly. Respect kitchens. Leave wells clean. Elsewhere, the coalition tried to make a last fortress out of Toran Prime. It had a sky that never managed true blue something in the dust, the old smoke of celebrations. They sent envoys who promised everything but changed nothing. They will dare us to be merciful so they can call us weak, the chief said, or cruel so they can call us monsters, the gunnery lead said. We will be specific, Mara said. Notary's first salvo took no towers. It took the antennae that lied. The second cut the rail yards that fed regiments. The third opened a hole in the sky for civilians to leave by if bravery ever stopped being the only flavor they wanted to taste. The fourth didn't come. Toran Prime surrendered before cruelty had a chance to ask for a seat. It couldn't be victories only. A sibling hull took a blind strike from a corvette that had survived by being too angry to die when it should have. The sibling bled heat like a wounded god and went dim without broadcasting. Mara read the casualty slate and sat on the steps of the bridge while others worked, and let her hands learn the shape of being still. The chief brought tea and said nothing, the way engineers apologize for physics. They will accuse us of empire, the chief said at last. Empires hold, Mara said. We let go. She marked supply depots for demolition that could not support a civilian winter, without being unfair to the people who had not fired the guns. She wrote orders to leave seed stores untouched. She signed for power grid repairs in places her lances had never touched. War that keeps the next harvest alive is harder and will be done, she wrote again in a margin, as if the sentence could be a small engine. The council called a session and did not fill the hall with ceremony. Delegates who had once practiced their smiles now practiced the art of occupying less space with the body. Rue 10 stood where Mara had once stood and read a proposal that did not beg it described. This chamber will recognize human boundaries as human boundaries. It will inventory its debts in names before numbers. It will retire disciplinary incursion from its tongue. A whisper went through the room. The last gasp of a vocabulary, discovering it would be allowed to rest. Invite her, someone said. Ask her to write the period at the end. Rue 10 did not smile. They don't write periods, he said. They prefer ellipses you are not invited to follow. Notary turned her bow toward the cold, where silence grew well. Mara looked at the chart of worlds that had been cruel by habit and now wanted, some honestly, some cleverly, to be forgiven. We will forget nothing, she said to the room that had learned to love her quiet. We will forgive nothing we cannot rebuild. The staff nodded. The feeds tried to make a story about vengeance tired. The cairns continued their reading, and people in kitchens and workshops learned to listen while their hands stayed busy, as if ghosts and bread had always shared the same hour. Toran Prime did not surrender because its leaders suddenly learned humility. It surrendered because the air itself grew honest. Notary's opening strikes had trimmed lies from the spectrum relay towers that massaged casualty numbers went dark. The state channel that had learned to sing through static fell silent, and the plazas lost their choreographed courage when speakers discovered they could no longer drown the sound of shoes leaving. Mara refused parades. She liked doors that opened at the right time and shut softly afterward. Cut only the arteries that feed the fist, she told Ops, and the plot thinned in careful lines, railheads, munition exchanges. Officer schools whose graduates had learned precisely the wrong century. The first white flags did not rise from palaces, but from kitchens. Cooks understand supply, and the city had been designed by men who who thought food appeared when you shouted loyalty. At a ledger, a courier ship angled out of cloud cover with an emblazoned crest that pretended not to be a plea. Envoys? The chief asked. Their words will arrive with gravity they did not earn, the gunnery lead said. Receive, Mara said, because courtesy is a tool, not a trophy. The envoys were practiced at contrition. They spoke of misunderstandings and rogue elements, of a coalition that had exceeded its brief, of a council that would, of course, rectify matters once the current emergency allowed for nuance. We will withdraw, their leader said, and managed to make the promise sound like a favor. You will inventory names, Mara said, before numbers, before credits, before treaties. She sent them back with a ledger template that began with columns for the dead we caused, the living we owe, and the worlds we are not welcome to visit again. The envoy's face tightened, then smoothed. He did not yet understand that a bill of particulars can be forgiveness if you write it with clean ink. The surrender ceremony, such as it was, happened in a hangar with a drip in one corner and the smell of overworked coolant. Mara stood under an industrial lamp that made no one look handsome. Varkesh did not come. He sent a marshal who knew how to bow and believed that bows could erase sentences. Your terms are severe, the marshal said, glancing at the template in which numbers had not yet found their places. Your education was lax, Mara said, and turned to the scribes with portable slates. Write clearly. Spelling is a kind of mercy. Outside, Notary kept station like a quiet thought someone refused to let go. His siblings fanned to the orbital edges, not in threat, but in surveillance. The way watchmen check that streetlights are still willing to hold back night out at dusk. A strike that no one ordered came in from the dark side, a feral cutter, crewed by the angry and the uninvited, spiked its drive and hurled itself at the surrendering city's comms ring. It was not courage. It was tantrum. The ring bloomed, and for a breath the plaza believed the old story would resume. Fire, noise, and the grace of an enemy who becomes a monster and thus absolves you of learning. Notary's countersalvo arrived late on purpose. She burned only the cutter's wake, rode its trajectory in a white line across a safe sky, and let the wreckage splash in a salt plain that had already known the lesson of evaporation. Civilians saw the choice. They kept walking toward the open corridor. We will be accused of arranging our own heroism, the chief said. Let them, Mara said. Heroism is a currency that buys nothing we need. For an hour, she permitted herself stillness. She sat on a crate and watched her crew eat in shifts, the way people who intend to be alive tomorrow handle spoons and jokes. The casualty slate for the sibling hull that had gone dim arrived names and a few images, the kind that survive cameras. A grin that chose the wrong instant, a hand in the act of waving, and thus forever waving. Mara read. She refused to be efficient about it. Efficiency is for engines. Names deserve time. She remembered the private on Holiday's Reach who had pried a cairn and woken an epitaph. She remembered the way the corridor had learned to whisper in frequencies that did not bruise ears. Grief and strategy sat beside her like two teachers who did not argue because each had a subject. A messenger from the council arrived under escort, Wu Ten's seal on the packet. The letter was unadorned, a draft recognition of human boundaries, a call to suspend disciplinary language, a proposal to audit debt in names before currencies. They listened, the chief said, not triumphantly, just accurately. They heard, Mara said. Listening is a posture. Hearing is a change. She signed the draft with a clause added in her square hand. Silence shall be recognized as a mode of communication. Lawyers would hate it. Good. Law that refuses new grammar is a scaffold pretending to be a cathedral. Night dropped fully. Tehran Prime's sky showed its old smoke. In the absence of speeches, the plazas found room for other sounds. A string instrument no amplifier had touched. A child asking if the stars would stay put now. No, her parents said wisely, but they will move where they mean to. Peace did not break like a wave. It accumulated like dew. Notary turned toward the belt, where the first incursions had learned arrogance and found it poor in voices. The coalition had discovered that retreat is a profession. It was learning the second lesson, which is that retreat can become a habit. Border systems, once loud with inspection orders and confiscations, now spoke softly of repairs. Mara liked repair. It is an honest verb. It admits the past and faces the future without pretending to be a bridge between them. Post-conflict doctrine, Op said, because doctrine loves to exist, even when guns are cased. We publish, we live it, Mara said. Publish later. When people think we invented what they have already learned, the doctrine looked like ordinary decency sharpened into a tool. Leave wells clean, fix lights, count out loud, pay forward food and medicine before demanding indemnities in metals and secrets. Install cairns where the worst had been done, not as monuments, but as metronomes let names set the rhythm of labor. In places where a broadcast had once lied, set a single channel to read the week's restorations. Roofs replaced, crops reseeded, ruptures sealed. We'll be accused of propaganda, the gunnery lead said, amused. Truth at a steady cadence is propaganda only to liars, Mara said. A rumor arrived that Varkish had rallied loyalists at a deep dock, a place named Station Kettle because it boiled every visitor's patience with its bureaucracy. He planned a lesson of his own, a raid dressed as reprisal, clean enough to be deniable, loud enough to be remembered. He needs one victory to tuck under his pillow, the chief said. He needs silence, Mara said, and pointed to the chart. Kettle sat inside a lopsided geometry of moons that made pretty diagrams for textbooks and nightmares for quartermasters. We can close the lid, the gunnery lead said, appreciating the joke too much. No, Mara said. We can invite the steam to leave. Hush 12 pulsed in slow measure, teaching instruments to honor older versions of themselves. Latency restored, overclocking shamed, bravado out of fashion. Notary and two siblings took the long, dull path that puts a ship where patience becomes quicker than speed. He will imagine ambush, the chief said. He will imagine himself the target, Mara said. We will make the kettle whistle. They arrived without trumpets. The dock, a lace of scaffolds and gantries over a cold, unloved rock, pretended not to be complicit in anything. Varkish's flotilla idled, hot and proud. He had ordered silence on channels, believing it to be stealth. His ships spoke anyway in heat and microdrifts, and the particular arrogance of captains who like to swing bows without clearance. Notary did nothing for 3 minutes. People remember minutes. On Kettle, workers paused with hooks halfway embedded in crates. A clerk reached for an old habit, the rubber stamp that made lies official, and found his hand hovering. A child on a crate counted backwards from 11, because children love to own numbers adults think are theirs. Broadcast, Mara said, and the message went out in a voice the dock recognized as adult. Notice, boundary, silence. Vessels present at Kettle will power down to cold and declare inventory and casualties. Any ship that departs along plotted safe lanes will be allowed to leave unharried. Any ship that lingers will be understood as choosing to learn slowly. Varkish broke first, because men who have been applauded all their lives do not learn to sit still in rooms that ask for quiet. He spun his flagship to present defiance. He launched a squadron to perform what doctrine calls presence. They entered, hushed Wells' manners, and discovered that presence behaves oddly when required to curtsy. Mark, Mara said. Notary laid a white line not across a hull, but across a lane, a chalk stripe that missiles would not cross, and brave men could. The squadron hesitated, and in hesitating, confessed everything. Two peeled off and ran along the plotted safe, discovering the pleasure of surviving under orders they had not issued. The others performed. Notary did not. She let the kettle whistle. The dock groaned like old metal, deciding to be honest. A siren that had whined through 3 regimes found a tone that meant stop. Varkish stared at screens that no longer rearranged the world for his comfort. He spoke the word that proud men speak when rooms do not rise to greet them. Impossible. Inventory, Mara said. And the dock began to speak numbers with the humility of people who understand that numbers are named shadows. Kettle emptied itself of the lesson Varkish had brought, and in so doing, taught him one he could not keep. He fled with the portion of his flotilla that still believed he had a future they wanted to inhabit. Notary did not pursue. She circled the dock and read the ledger aloud on open bands. Water, fuel, spares, bodies claimed, unclaimed, damage, self-inflicted, inflicted by others, repaired. "We will be accused of bookkeeping at gunpoint," the chief said. "Yes," Mara said, "because they forgot books keep." The last courier from the council arrived with signatures. The chamber had voted, not out of fear, but out of an understanding that fear had finished teaching, and prudence wanted the room. Boundaries recognized, disciplines retired, debts to be inventoried in names before numbers, silence affirmed as communication. Ruten's hand had written a note in the margin. "Doors swing. Thank you for showing us hinges." Mara penned a reply on the same line, so the ink would mingle. "Keep carpenters on retainer. Rooms must be maintained at watch's end." Mara walked Notary's spine alone and laid her palm on the hall the way farmers touch the first fence post of a season. She thought of Vesper's window and a shuttle that had made rain, of Holiday's reach and its metronome of failing sensors, of Keeler 19 and the lanterns that went out without malice. She thought of the cairns, still reading where needed. "We warned them," she said into the dark, not for the satisfaction of being right, but for the relief of truth having found its echo. The hull thrummed the way well-built things do when they are allowed to rest. Far below, on worlds that would now have next harvests, people slept the kind of sleep that grants tomorrow permission to begin. The council chamber remembered how to be quiet before business, which is to say it remembered how to be a room instead of a stage. Delegates entered with shoulders that did not beg their robes to widen. The moderator of stone called the roll with a voice that did not advertise importance. Attendance is not virtue. Ruten stood, not at the center plinth, where men have tried to control echoes, but to one side, where acoustics forgive haste less. "The text recognizes the sovereign boundaries of Terra and her colonies," he said. "It retires disciplinary language from our tongue. It describes a mechanism by which we will count debts in names before currencies." He did not read the clause about silence as communication allowed. He did not need to. The room had learned grammar in the weeks since the armada had gone to pieces trying to define it. A delegation rose to object on stylistic grounds. "Style is the last refuge of people who have run out of outcomes. We cannot let a precedent stand in which threats are rewarded," the speaker said, finding refuge in the word threat. "We were warned," Ruten said, finding refuge in the word warned, which has the grace to care for the future instead of detaining it. "We were taught," he added, and looked directly where cameras do not like to look in the space between two dignitaries' faces. The vote came. Lights turned from amber to green, not with a cheer, but with the kind of exhale that docs make when strain leaves. Mara entered later, after the work had been done. She did not like rooms that wanted to turn people into symbols. Symbols are hungry, and she had ships to feed. She accepted a simple acknowledgement, the kind that fits in the hand, a seal with the words notice, boundary. Silence cut cleanly, where lawyers could not sand them down. "You will not be staying?" Ruten asked. "Rooms must be maintained," Mara said, with a glance that included the dais and the door. "And corridors must be watched." "You built a door," Ruten said. "We learned to mark which way it swings." "Keep carpenters," Mara said. "Hinges rust." They walked together a few steps, as equals who had not started as such. "What will you do with your victory?" Ruten asked, and did not flinch at the rudeness of the question. "Spend it on boredom," Mara said. "On schools that teach windows and evacuations, and the mathematics of not being surprised. On shipyards that remember repair more than parade. On stations that broadcast schedules and not songs about themselves." "They will call it small," he said. "They always do, until they try to do it," she said. "Then they call it hard." Outside, a small crowd had gathered without ceremony. They did what crowds do when history ends a chapter without fireworks. They took pictures of themselves and sent them to people who would be making dinner. A child in a jacket 2 sizes too big tugged at Mara's sleeve and said, "Do the stars stay still now?" "No," Mara said, pleased to recognize a question that deserved repetition. "But we know which way our doors open." The child considered this, nodded as if she'd been given permission to own the sky, and ran back to show a friend she had spoken to a person some will insist on calling a hero. Heroes are bad at grocery lists. Mara hoped the child would learn to love lists. Notary took her place at the edge of a lane that would not peer on civilian charts. The siblings scattered with the purposeful laziness of shepherd dogs that know their flock at last prefers the fence. The Vassar array cooled into a map of absence that engineers would visit on pilgrimages to remember that the best tools are often manners. The cairns read where reading was still owed, and in kitchens people made their peace with hearing names while chopping and stirring. Proof that memory and sustenance share a rhythm. A last message came from Varkesh, stripped of crest and polish. It did not ask forgiveness. Pride often can't pronounce the word. It complained of humiliation, of a galaxy that had forgotten how to respect power. Mara answered once, "For the record, we respected yours enough to plan for it. Respect ours enough to leave it alone." She added his name to a ledger column titled, "People who may one day learn, a mercy extended without optimism." Mercies do not require optimism. They require spine dot at shift change. Mara walked the long gangway under Notary's skin. She let her palm find the seam where two plates met so well. The seam existed only for people who cared. "We are not quiet because we are afraid," she said, repeating the sentence that had once sounded like a warning to a room that loved its voice. "We are quiet because we chose the size of the room." She thought of all the rooms she had built, council chambers taught to hear, corridors taught to delay, docks taught to confess, then of the rooms she would leave alone, places where people would teach themselves without needing a ship's shadow to discipline the curriculum. Sunrise found a colony market loading scales that had not lied in months. A boy practiced counting back change out loud. A woman set a timer for bread and did not look at the sky for the duration. In a classroom with a cracked window, a teacher wrote 3 words on a board and asked the students to define them using examples from the last year. Notice, boundary, silence. Hands went up. Arguments were had. Laughter happened and did not pretend to be defense. Outside, the cairn at the edge of the settlement finished one list of names and, in the pause before the next, let the wind speak without competition. Every lesson deserves a breath. It is the nature of warnings to become folklore and then proverb. The story of the council that laughed and the species that did not was already shedding proper nouns. That is healthy. Proper nouns demand monuments. Proverbs fit in pockets. On a refinery ring over a planet that had once profited from disciplined trade, a new manager taught apprentices to look for gaps in schedules and fill them with decency. On a moon where soldiers with nothing left to defend had carved their names into a rock, a school group came with paper and charcoal and made rubbings, then took them back to a cafeteria where the cook pinned copies near the weekly menu. A humble act that made memory ordinary. Notary, veined and cold, wrote her own ordinary. She adopted a patrol cycle that would bore poets and save lives. She drilled without drama, power down to cold without complaint, wake on a whisper, spin to track a thing that might be a ship or a lie or a meteor, deciding to remember it was a story once. The siblings learned to yawningly herd smugglers with a tap on a radiator instead of a sermon. Ops escalated paperwork over weapons. The crew, bereft of battle's sharpness, rediscovered the talents that make peace work. Hunting for leaks no one else hears, arguing about tea, teaching a junior to love a cleanliness inspection because the hull deserves courtesy. Once because no story is tidy trouble did not knock. A privateer tested a boarder with a gun he did not deserve, and a grievance he had cultivated the way people who lack crops cultivate weeds. He took 3 shots at a relief convoy and broadcast a manifesto that had the good lines of a better cause attached like stolen feathers. Notary did not make a speech. She cut his drive to drift, tagged his hull with a paint that makes shame visible in polite spectrums, and towed him to a court that owned enough quiet to listen. "We will be accused of theater," the gunnery lead said, making the same old joke with the same old fondness. "Let them," Mara said. "Some lessons benefit from good seats." The council, older now by a vocabulary, kept its carpenters. It closed doors with care and hung signs over the loud ones that said, "Learn first." It kept Rue 10 busy with dull work, which is the noblest use of wisdom. Budget meetings that end on time, audit committees that read documents before voting, tasking memos that ask questions instead of affirming assumptions. He wrote occasionally to Mara, not to extract strategy, but to share the small victories that keep institutions honest. A junior who corrected a senior politely and was praised. A vote in which the minority was treated not as a wound, but as a nerve. Varkesh disappeared into the portion of history that swallows men who mistake applause for appetite. There are theories, exile, self-imposed, a last raid that brought none of the satisfaction his mirror had promised, a quiet death on a planet that never learned his name. The cairns did not read his. They read the others, and where bitterness wanted to take root, names choked it with the discipline of a roll call. In some places, people learned to bring flowers. In others, they brought tools. Time, indulgent at last, let last year's fires cool into the background of jokes. Remember when the stars stopped returning calls? Someone would say at a table, and someone else would raise a glass and say, "We were busy teaching them how to answer." Children gods bless their unfaithfulness to trauma-used Hush 12 as playground code for do not tell, and teachers smiled and let the lesson live as slang. The phrase room we built entered 2 languages as an idiom for any framework that makes rudeness expensive. On a midwatch, when the ship was all breath and heartbeat, Mara stood with the universe at a polite distance and considered the luxury of not needing to be clever. She had spent a career arranging absence, teaching instruments to mind their manners, showing empires the hinge. Now the work asked for endurance and sweetness, 1,000 repetitive choices to be specific when it would be easier to be grand. She wrote a memo to her future self, because fatigue loves generalities. Be precise, count, repair, refuse to be bored by decency. She took one last tour of the array's long edge, the gradient where signals put on their formal wear, and learned to arrive on. Time then called ops to lower the room. Hush stations powered down into maintenance naps. The pockets relaxed. The chalk lines faded from lanes they had protected. "You're taking the teeth out," the chief said, half accusation, half hope. "Teeth remain," Mara said. "We're putting the lips back on. Mouths should close unless there is something worth saying." The crew understood. A ship can tell when its captain trusts the room. Before gone, a final message left notary. It did not ride on a carrier designed to impress. It went out on a band that kitchens could pick up and docks could post on corkboards. It was not a warning. Warnings are for the before. It was instruction and promise and proverb in 3 lines. The same that had once been placed on a plinth and left like a seed. Notice, boundary, silence. People read it with hands that smell of work, nodded, and put it beside lists of groceries and shifts and birthdays. In this way, doctrine became culture, which is the only place doctrine ever belongs when it intends to last. The galaxy did not kneel. It adjusted. It learned to find its voice, and then to keep it when rooms asked for quiet. It learned to harvest without boasting. It learned to count before it crowed. And when a new species, born fresh with the arrogance of first metals and first sales, laughed at a warning carried into their chamber by a soft voice from a blue world, someone in the back, an elder who had once been young in the age of noise, smiled and said, "Listen, the silence is about to teach."